these things. I've mentioned that he was involved as one of the participants in the ISO working group representing Canada. And in addition to that, he has been involved in the GRI standards, the accountability standards, which was a standard that participated in the development of ISO 26000. I think I'll stop there, but you should amplify on any other relevant point as it comes up. And I'm going to step aside. David Simpson.
Well, thank you, Kernahan. And I mean, just to, again, I mean, when Kernahan is being purposely modest in his remarks about the Canadian footprints, as it were, fingerprints on this document throughout. So I think it's interesting, although certainly in terms of different areas, Canadians have been both a help, very much so, and also a hindrance at different levels as well, too. So it's interesting. So I've been asked to provide an overview of the standard, and I think many of you are probably somewhat familiar with it. I see some people who have been intimately involved with it as well. And then to respond to some of the most frequently asked questions, and then move on to some of the more experiences with the Canadian Committee in terms of what our role was and what does this actually mean launching as we are at this point, the Canadian adoption of this standard, and what does that mean. Kernahan set it up very nicely in terms of the background. I think it's very important. So I'm just going to kind of, hopefully a lunchtime presentation, try and make it a little bit zippy, and then we can kind of, hopefully we'll all be part of the same element, and maybe we can engage later on some of those things. So the first question in terms of what is ISO 26000, as Kernahan's laid out already, in terms of it's a social responsibility guidance standard, not to be confused with what we've talked about earlier about ISO 9001 or 14001, which are more certification standards, which when you're on your way to the airport, you see buildings with the ISO 14001, and again, you get a little tick mark to that as well. So this is very much a voluntary guidance standard, and it does not establish requirements. And so it gives rather more recommendations of actions. And so for greater clarity, what this means is essentially the standard would say more this should do this rather than you shall do this in elements. So it's not necessarily to follow something. It's more of a guidance in terms of how you do something. So it's not a management system standard, meaning that it's not necessarily a process that you have to follow. It's not something that you do 1 or 2 and 3 and then bingo, then you've arrived. This leaves us fairly open in terms of organizations, and again, this was made for organizations, so not only businesses, and that's why we deliberately the C has fallen off the standard. And so it was looking at those elements of we're leaving this up to organizations to apply these principles generally, how they might suit them themselves. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not designed for certification, at least at an international level, and we'll come back to some of those things later on. In terms of who does it apply to, Kernahan touched on this, but it's really all organizations, private, public, companies, charities, NGOs, unions, government agencies as well. The only thing it doesn't really apply to is government in the role of the state on these kind of democratic elements. We give them a pass to say they will have the authority to do what they want to applying what is socially responsible. In terms of purpose, I think we can probably best say that the purpose is best expressed through the kind of 3 C's. So the first C being that of coherence, coverage, and credibility. So coherence is really about improving the awareness of social responsibility standards. And through this process, you had an enormous amount of awareness. And this is an international process, as Kernahan's pointed out. And it brings together, as he mentioned also, a number of these standards, these frameworks, these elements that have existed already. And in some ways, it was set out to be a bit of a harmonization standard. What standards do, essentially, is looking to get that harmonization. So bringing all of these standards and frameworks into an element so that we can get some coherence about what are we talking about when we're talking about social responsibility. And another key part of that is common terminology. And as you'll no doubt when you start talking about social responsibility, or indeed some of the work that I've done earlier as a kind of a social auditor, because a social auditor was that we go to parties and audit them, or you know, what is this kind of things that you would do? So we have to have that understanding of what we're talking about when we're talking about social responsibility. Not an easy task when you can't even get that agreement in a national environment. Not you know, we respect heads nodding on that in different countries. So that's that coherence element about like here's this an international standard. So you know, if they immediately think of an organization that might have a larger footprint, supply chain, if you will. So social responsibility can mean the same thing in this place as it may in another branch, for example, in another country, in another cultural context, because that's kind of part of this filtration process. And that brings us to the second C, which is coverage, being kind of international and that kind of broad scope of subject areas. And finally, credibility. And credibility largely came from that element that Grant spoke about through the process itself. The fact that we had this engagement process that included all of these different stakeholders gives the process itself some credibility. Who created it, and it was, you know, this contested area, but through it there was some agreement on it. In terms of how social responsibility is defined, getting on the current terminology we're talking about, this is probably, in my opinion, probably the greatest achievement of ISO 26000 in terms of the definition of social responsibility. Now this is largely an accepted definition for social responsibility internationally. So this is it as it appears in the standard, and as you know, this is the kind of the core element, if you will, that's looking for this element of impacts of decisions of organizations. And it includes, very interesting, this element of transparency, but also that of ethical behavior, and that's not necessarily kind of, well, we kind of left that up for people to understand. This notion that social responsibility very much relates to sustainable development. Very key, particularly in an area where we're talking about the sustainable development goals now, so we'll see how that kind of carries out. This notion of taking account of the expectation of stakeholders. So this element of it is very important to social responsibility. Of course, it's compliance with law, being as more as kind of a base minimum. And that it's not necessarily seen as just a unique element, but it's seen to have these kind of larger tails, so that social responsibility expands through what they call this kind of sphere of influence. And so it's throughout the organization and practice throughout its relationships. And that term also comes up again when we look at the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, this element of business relationships. And so it's all these things start to kind of fit together as we see. So another question was, well, you know, we talked about a certification standard. Well, why not a certification standard? And as Graham pointed out, it's a contested process in some ways. And there was concern among some that it would inhibit the uptake by, you know, particular smaller organizations. There's a distrust about the notion of certification from some stakeholder groups, some NGOs, some labor groups don't like this areas that someone else would tell you what if your labor standards are applied. Well, that's a job of unions. So there's always this turf war on different things. And so it was seen as a bit of a compromise position, particularly at the international arena, that there would not be a certification standard. Equally, in terms of management system standard, it was seen, well, look, companies already have this. Organizations have their own management system standards in place, you know, and they do that very well. So there's no necessary, we can overlay this simply to their existing management systems. Now, in terms of what ISO covers, what we have within that. So it's really these kind of three areas that we'll see within the standard. And this is just, you know, a book that, as I say, goes through the kind of the shoulds, you should do this, you should consider these elements. Key to that are these principles. So the principles kind of are the overlay, as you would within developing a law, this notion in terms of interpretation. So you have this accountability, transparency, ethical behavior, respect for stakeholder interests, the rule of law, international norms of behavior, which is an interesting element when you think about what are norms, and then respect for human rights. That kind of sets out the groundwork, if you will, for what it covers. And then you move into these elements in terms of, okay, well, that's nice to have that understanding in terms of recognizing what are we talking about. Then we move very quickly in terms of, well, what does actually mean? So the what, the core subjects of what this is going to be. And you'll see there's the 6 plus 1, these areas that go into it. So the organization also actually sets so organizational governance being key. So those are the contents that you are around. And then finally, the how is really operationalizing social responsibility. Now, how do I do it? And there's a kind of element to do it. Again, it's not a management system standard, so it's not saying you have to do 1, 2, 3, and then 4. So you can do any one of these, but these are the kind of elements that you should probably consider in terms of operationalizing social responsibility. Now, this is in a nutshell. This is a rather confusing element of what this all means. This is this is actually from the standard itself. So, yeah, no spoiler alert or stuff like that, so you can get to see what it is. But essentially, all those elements we've just talked about are all part of that. Because I just want to point out some particular notions here at the beginning. This element of recognizing social responsibility really comes from that notion of both transparency and accountability. This commitment that you would have to start off travels throughout. Those are fundamental practices of social responsibility. And this element that we talked about before, stakeholder engagement. It's not just a slice in time, it's stakeholder engagement throughout, which hopefully was mirrored in the development of the standard as well. So I won't confuse you anymore with that element, but this kind of is the cheat sheet, if you will, or one from the ISO standard. I did speak a little bit about the core subjects earlier. Here's a kind of quick graphic of those. So what are the coveraging? So you have to look at human rights, labor practices, fair operating practices, might much deal with anti-corruption and elements like that. Consumer issues, what's that mean from fair advertising to consumer issues around what that means for consumer rights, as I go obviously the environment, and then community involvement development. Now, this is very interesting because if you go back even, and I know some of you are, have worked in this field or certainly have been in this area for quite some time, you'll note that when we talk about corporate social responsibility, many times we might have just been talking about one of those bullets. So maybe a community investment or philanthropy policy is we invest in my child's soccer team and stuff like that. That's social responsibility. And sure, that might have been part of it, but now through the standard, we say, well, actually, there's all these elements that should be part of it, including the organizational governance, and that's why I said this is the +1. And this relates really much to applying the principles in the very front end. So if you get that right, the rest of it should kind of flow very nicely. So the next question then says, well, great, there's all these different balloons and everything else that have all these 6+1 areas or the 7 kind of core subjects. If you're an organization, do you have to implement the whole thing? And so there is some guidance on that as well. Now, you don't have to do anything, it's a voluntary standard. But it's saying, well, if you were going to claim any claims around social responsibility, you should be taking them all of those areas into account. So you can't cherry pick and say, well, actually, we do very good work in the environment, and so we're going to stake our claim in terms of being a socially responsible company on this. A number of solar companies, for example, are in that space for many times, but the actual solar panels were developed in factories that had very poor labor practices. So you can't, you'd say, well, this is the whole enchilada, if you will. It's not just kind of a picking and choosing of those elements. So it's this integrated notion of what social responsibility is going to become. Now, this issue often comes up, and this is really, well, why should you then care, right? Because this is like a standard of what's out there, and there's no bite. And we're only really care if we can, if there's some standard that bites at the end. So the certification standard, you either get it or you don't get it. And you can claim it, whether it's you put it in your products or you put it on your factory of ISO, 26,000 compliant. In this case, you can't do that. Just do it. But this one doesn't have that notion. And so a lot of people have suggested, well, it's not necessarily there, but you have the power of the ISO brand, which we talked about, and the scaling issue is very much important. So we have other social responsibility standards that the most successful among them being around the GRI. Say you might have, say, 7,000 organizations that maybe signed up to it formally. When we move to the ISO standards and see what the uptake is, that we're in the area of like 1 million or 2 million of organizations around the world that are certified. This is a scaling issue to some degree as well. We have international recognition and acceptance on something, and it captures this notion of what a benchmark is in terms of what societal expectations are here. So that's what we have in terms of the standard now. Those expectations are not expectations that are only here, but they're around the world now of what we're going to do. And I think we have to be careful, though, when we say this standard has no teeth, And this is this area.
I thought you said you're dead but not bad.
That was not my dog.
So anytime I can put a Peter Sellers clip in my presentations, I don't refuse to do. But this actually serves a good purpose, is that the element is that perhaps the standard doesn't have a bite, but that's not your dog. Your dog is found somewhere else, and this may be in a sector, it may be within a consumer group and everything else, is that they may have the bite. The standard itself is not going to have a monitoring and policing unit, but you might find this quite easily with an RFP, for example, or an organization who wants to is bidding for a particular group, and if those familiar with it, they'll be very familiar with you have like price and quality. What's the quality of your product? Explain that to me. What's the price of your proposal that you're putting in? And what are you doing in this area of social responsibility, as defined by ISO 26000? It's no longer just you're supporting the buying sweatshirts for your daughter's soccer. We now have an understanding of what that is. And perhaps in an RFP process, we're just giving that 5%. Well, those of you who are familiar with that, who have bid, 5% is actually quite a bit on some of these RFPs now. So suddenly this becomes a competitive environment, and now we're talking about whose dog is biting, as it might be something else as well. And we also are finding these actually in procurement standards, because in the last, well, I think it's now, there's another standard also developing, and some people will be familiar with it in the room in terms of the procurement standard on sustainable development as well, which is going kind of co-committally as well, which is also coming up in this area as well.
Sorry to interrupt, but when the RFP say and they ask about your compliance with ISO 26000, what does the organization say if they don't have any kind of approval?
Well, that's good. So I'm imagining, for example, would say, as defined by, so we now know what we're talking about. So then you can say, well, actually, here's what we do, and it's a transparent process. Here's what we do in the environment. Here's what we do in human rights. Here's what we do in terms of our labor standards. We have a report out. You can look at that on our web or something like that. So it's a more transparent thing, and then you could evaluate that. But it's a good question. And we'll see how that's also approached at an international level as well. Kurt has spoke about this, so I won't spend too much time, but we see this as again, this kind of harmonization standard of where things are fitting rather than just a competing element, because this is a question I always get asked in terms of, well, which standards, what should we use, David? What's the killer app, as it were? And really, that's not the right question. It's like, well, it depends what you're doing, and this might be an element for organizations to consider. It might fit very well with their missions, or not. And this is getting to that same question in terms of, well, how can you judge an organization from performance without this? And this is, again, part of a dialogue process. It's part of a transparency mechanism that you use. And as we're seeing is that other organizations are now, the marketplace itself are putting up solutions to this, because marketplaces, if they want these conformity assessments, they're getting them, but maybe not through a formal ISO recognition, but other third-party bodies. We'll talk about that in a moment. I did want to talk to you about our kind of made in Canada approach. So what does that mean? So this was our committee in terms of what we're doing here. And it took us quite a while. Yeah, this is the most Canadian picture you can get apparently on the internet. So you got your Tim Hortons, a monkey, and a beaver.
Isn't that Pittsburgh, though?
It's Lemieux, though. So to explain a little bit about that process, and I think Anne-Marie, I'll leave a lot to you talking about more formally about that. But just saying, well, it was important for us to kind of look at these questions to consider whether we needed additional guidance in this area. So the kind of things that we put in front of our committee was, does the existing standard prioritize, or does it provide sufficient guidance for Canadian organizations? Does the existing standard require additional context? Does the terminology that we're using, does that also meet with what we're using in Canada? And are there other guidance available, or other standards that's out there that need to be in part of the Canadian version of that standard? Now, ultimately, we decided as our group is that And we were exploring other things, particularly in the group that we have. And this is committee structure as well, looking at different stakeholder groups. But we did look at issues of, say, Aboriginal issues, or is that an area we need to kind of reinforce a little bit more? Issues of LGBTQ issues within the Canadian context, is that something that needs to be strengthened? Issues of inequality, for example. But ultimately, we said, well, there is actually probably more use, and I don't want to speak for all the committee members, but in terms of how we decided at this point, is that the international standard will also be reviewed in due process. And so that might be a feed in which the Canadian committee will feed into that process to perhaps make some of those issues also as important at the international level as well. So to inform the Canadian committee, we looked at things also as what's happening in other areas. And so for that, we want to take a step back. And here's where we're looking at kind of those approaches of what's happening internationally since we have this international standard. Canada is not alone by adopting this as a national standard. And indeed, the big picture, as it were, was the 75 plus countries have adopted this as a national standard. And you can see some of these statistics claiming 16,000 copies of the standard have been sold in 50 countries since 2010. And I believe it's some 23 or 25 different languages that it's been translated into. Again, a great benefit if you wanted to push this out to your supply chain in Brazil speaking Portuguese, or Chile, or whatnot, and say, great, well, this is a standard that we're applying across our organization, and it's going to be a kind of useful element as well. So this is again being constantly updated as well. You'll see now we can move Canada over to this side of the ledger now, so that's a bit of an enjoyment part for us as well. In terms of other things we're seeing in terms of ISO 26000, we see it referenced in EU directives, which makes it applicable to all members of the EU. And so these are now where we're getting into areas that Kernighan was getting at a little bit in terms of this area of soft law, where we're starting to see, well, how is this being interpreted in different areas? It's being specifically referenced in Chile's national strategy, where you're having national strategies developed in different countries, and saying, well, ISO 26000 is seen as a standard that we'll follow. It's referenced in sector standards. So the wine industry, for example, is looking at this and saying, well, how can we take our very specific things that are happening in the wine industry and bring in those elements that have been decided. Again, that benchmark at an international level. And municipal governments. Thailand, the Ministry of Industry has a program now that requires companies to operate in accordance to ISO 26000. Not too sure what that accordance means, but it is an audited process, so they would have their own kind of element. Indonesia bases a national CSR standard on it. Singapore Stock Exchange references ISO 26000 as a global standard on social responsibility. Bangladesh and the Bangladesh Chamber of Commerce and the Canadian High Commission has published an implementation guide for ISO 26000 as well. So we're seeing a great deal of things happening internationally, and now we're just at a Canadian element of just at the launching part. So in terms of the international toolbox, we see what things that are also going on. So there's I've classified them in this area: certifications, self-assessments, and we call them other tools that might be a part of the toolbox. So the certifications are pretty self-explanatory, but we kind of talked a little bit about at the international level, it's not certifiable, but different member countries or member bodies, national standard bodies, have taken it upon themselves to actually develop a certifiable standard. So in those areas, we have countries like Austria, Denmark, and Portugal. They've developed this. Korea has a verified CSR standard based on the ISO 26000. And there's a number of private standards. And so I talk about third party, that kind of marketplace approach as well. So business in the community in the UK, in particular in Ireland, has developed a rating tool that you could then put them to certify with that. And also in the Netherlands and Belgium has this tool called a CSR ladder, this kind of element that you move up on and down and something. And again, you can access these on the internet. They're all there to see. This element of self-assessments, or what's called self-declarations, is also an area where some standards bodies have gone down that route as well. And so there you have organizations such as the Dutch National Standard Body, the Swedish National Standards Body, and the French has an experimental standard on it, but I don't know to what degree they're actually using this on. is they're allowing organizations through a transparency process, that accountability mechanism we talked about earlier, for them to make a self-assessment and for them to say, yes, we're in compliance, and here's our evidence, and we'll put that also in a public area. And you can judge us upon that based on some of the criteria that's been laid out. And then finally, some of the other tools. And I don't know to what degree you might be talking about that, but certainly the CSA here has a carbon neutral registry, which is some of those kind of other tools that might be very specific for, in this case, climate change. The Bureau National du Québec has a sustainable development standard that they have for the province. I spoke a little bit about the sustainable procurement standard, the ISO 2400, and there's a number of different guidance standards that are out there. So we're getting this patchwork now of things kind of coming together as all this, an architecture, an ecosystem in which these standards kind of exist. So another question that's off now is could the standard be used as a barrier for trade companies in some countries? Now, I think Kernahan dealt with this right at the very beginning. ISO isn't an intergovernmental body. It does have special standing within the WTO as a kind of recognized group, but it doesn't have any kind of particular limits. And in fact, its mission is to enhance trade, international trade. So it really shouldn't. But at the same time, this is a very concern for a number of organizations saying, oh, we're going to have these standards in place. What can they use as a negative element? And to some degree, we do see that. We're starting to see this clause is dealt not only in RFPs, as we've talked about, but in bilateral and multilateral trade deals as well. So trade with the Scandinavian countries, for example, in Chile, they've now signed a formal kind of bilateral, that there will be some elements of social responsibility as part of those trade agreements. We've seen that here more recently with the TPP that Canada is also a member of. Within Article 9.18 of the TPP, it asks for all member states to reaffirm the importance to enterprise to incorporate internal policies of those internationally recognized standards, guidelines, and principles on corporate social responsibility. This notion of corporate responsibility appears 4 times in 3 different chapters in the TPP. So we're seeing an area where we're entering into this soft law area. What does this actually mean?
Mentioned is actually meaningful, or is just be good?
So these are all.
That doesn't sound very.
These are interpretive elements, but it's there. So the element is now they have, by signing that, and this is an area where we get into international law where you're signing up to things, you now have an obligation, as you do with the OECD membership, to say, well, you have to provide certain things within that because of membership. So now you have to promote, and it's at that level, but where does that go? So if you're chasing that, and you're sitting in a Canadian context going, if I'm looking where the train is going, I can see clearly where the destination is. And so, and this is potentially a danger also in terms of the area of competitiveness, because we're seeing what other countries are starting to do in this area. And where's Canada in this area? Because we haven't been very strong in terms of taking advantage within organizations of standards, unlike other countries necessarily. We're pretty good at developing them, and but in terms of the application, there's in some of these areas, we'll see where they evolve. And so there's also this thing called, it was explained to me once, the kind of Dutch mafia. I don't know if you've heard this element. The Dutch are particularly good at applying standards within the organizations. Again, this isn't at a trade level of a barrier, but it's intercompany. So the Dutch are very good at developing standards and applying them themselves. So it's almost a sense where you can kind of manage competition that way too. It's like, well, if companies to companies can insist on whatever they want. If I'm a company A and say you need to have an ISO 26000 or some element of certification, whether in an accountability mechanism or whatnot, I get to decide that. So again, you want to see what's the Gretzky, you want to see where the puck is going, and I think clearly we have some aspirations in that as well.
So, it sounds to me like a paradox. Internationally, standard is not certifiable, quite right. But national, standard associations have developed national standards based on ISO 26000. So my question is, could an organization be have as a barrier the fact that it can not get a certified ISO 26000, certified ISO 26000, but a competitor comes from a country that it's actually certified at the national level?
Are you going to talk about that at all, or? So really this is, because you get different, so the three bodies, the national standard bodies they have, so in the case of Austria or Denmark or Portugal, for example, they would certify for their own national standards. So it would not be an ISO certification, it would be a Danish Standard Board certification. Now, it's up to anyone to accept the credibility of that. But so we don't have the big Uber structure yet, but we start seeing some of the requirement for that.
But in Canada, is there not a more complex problem is that many of the standards or many of the issues that are contained in this standard are not national in scope, but provincial. So, for example, environmental standards and labor standards, provincial governments have a substantial responsibility for those areas, not the national government. So, the provincial government is not involved directly. I don't see how it's operationalized.
So again, we're not in the realms of law regulation. This is a voluntary standard. Now, that should be somewhat permeable. It should be kind of a cell which things are going involved in both that. And incidentally, I mean, Izzy was representing a provincial government at the time in the MIRA committee. So we did have that reference sometimes with the provincial governments. And indeed, on our current member committee, we have 3 or 4 different provincial governments kind of represented in that areas too. But it's, again, it's a desirable element of not to be, these aren't looking to, you will enforce our law. God, yeah, that would be a level of detail perhaps they're going too far. So just on the final slide here of where we're going as a committee, I think there's many options on the table. We've seen some of those in terms of what we're looking at within other countries. And currently, the committee that we've structured, we haven't come down on anywhere other than to say that everything's on the table in terms of do we need other tools? Do we need elements of certification, self-assessments or other tools like the CSA's tools and those. So again, it's responding to market mechanisms, and much of that will depend on some of the people in this room as well to say, well, where do you want the standards to evolve, and is there a market, is there a demand for that, both on the supply side and on the demand side in terms of the standards as well. So we're certainly monitoring those develops nationally. We're in terms of contributing to what's happening also at the international in terms of the review that's happening in 2017 of the international standards. So that will be a part of this committee. And I think we'll also look to ensure that Canadian organizations, as I mentioned, aren't necessarily falling behind. So we want to make sure this notion of competitiveness also stays fairly central to our mind. And again, part of the mission of ISO as well is to look at to enhance and facilitate trade as well. And that's part of the mandate of our committee, I think, will be to look at that as well. The terms of reference, I'm going to leave to you of the committee because you might talk a little bit about that. But that should give you a fairly broad overview, and then I'm looking forward to some of the other discussions in terms of the applications. I'll leave that for a minute. So thank you.
Thanks very much, David. One thing